In this video, we're going to create a button component. In the last video, we had set up our workspace, so we're ready to start creating new libraries. If you haven't already seen that video, go back and check it out so as you have the same setup that I do. What I would recommend is installing the NX VS Code extension. This allows us to generate libraries and components and run tasks very easily, and it'll simplify your development process. So we'll start by running generate. This will prompt us with all the list of things that are available. So we want to create an Angular library. So you'll see at narwhal/Angular library. So if we click that, we're going to create a library called button. We're going to choose Sass. We probably won't be leveraging much of the Sass language itself, but you can choose whatever you like. We have a few other options here. Most of these we can skip. Import path is important. So this is going to be the name that someone would use to import your button in their application. So I'm going to call ours devbytes/button. Okay, and we're going to be using ESLint. We can choose a prefix. Now it's good to prefix your components with a unique 2, 3, 4 letter abbreviation or something to differentiate between your components and the components of the consuming application, which are usually prefixed with app. In our case, we're going to call it BYT. We want to make our library publishable, which means we can put it on NPM. So we're going to tick this box as well. We can keep the rest the same. The only other one that we want to address is we want to tick this strict option. This essentially turns on TypeScript's stricter type checking settings to ensure we're creating the best type checked code that we can, and hopefully catch a few errors that could occur by loosely typing things. So you'll see we get a preview in the console here of what files are going to be created. They haven't actually been created yet because this is what's known as a dry run. So this runs it in memory but doesn't actually persist anything to disk. So to actually run it, we press the run button in the top right hand side, and this is going to create the files and install any packages that we might need. So while that's installing, you'll see we have a few extra files. It is now set up Jest as our test runner. It has created an ESLint config now that we have some code to lint, and it's created this folder under the libs directory called button. And inside we've created all the configuration that we need to build and test our library. We also have a source folder that has a button module in it. So first thing I'm going to do while this is installing is I like to rename my modules so as they are unique to my library. So I'm going to call this BYT button module. Just in case the consuming application also has a button module, this allows it to easily be differentiated. Now let's go ahead and create our button component. We can do this again through the NX console extension, and we choose the generate option, and this time we want to search for component. We're going to call this button component. We're going to add it to our button project. We're going to change our style to be Sass. Change detection is set by default, or set to default, but we want to change this to onPush. OnPush means that we are going to tell Angular when to run change detection in this component. Angular will automatically run change detection when an input is changed or an output emits, but this will help optimize our component to ensure it doesn't run change detection unnecessarily. We want to tick the export flag. This means that someone who imports button module can now use the button component. Lastly, again, we just want to set BYT. This is usually set by default in workspace.json, so we don't really need this, but I'm just showing you that it is an option. And that is all we need to set for now. Now, if we take a look at the output structure, we have our button project, and then in source, lib, and button folder, we have our components created. Now, what I like to do is I like to put all my components in a components subdirectory. because we might also have services or directives or anything else in this library. So this just helps me group things together nicely. So I just do that by prefixing the name with components/button. And now I'm happy to run this. So that has now created our files, and we can see our button module has been updated. We now have this button component as well. So like we did before, I like to rename my button component with a prefix. And you can refactor in VS Code, usually by pressing F2. And this will then rename other instances of it. So for example, you will now see our button module has been updated as well. So I'll save those changes. And you'll notice when I save, I have Prettier extension installed. So our code gets reformatted nicely. You'll notice in the root of our project, we have a Prettier RC file, which NX sets up for us. I've configured this slightly differently than the default setup, because this is the setup that I prefer, but you do whatever settings you like. So on save now, my code can get automatically formatted. Now that we have our button set up and created, we want to make sure that someone can access this in their application. And what I mean by this is, if I want to find a component in Angular, I use viewChild, for example. So, and then I pass the instance of the component that I want to find. So byt components, and then I can do button. Now, for someone to be able to import byt component, this library must make it publicly accessible. So to do this, there's an index.ts file in the root of our project, and currently we are only exporting the things from button module. So this means someone could import byt button module, but they can't import byt button component. So they cannot do things like viewChild. So we also want to make sure that we export this component as well. And we export component. Great. So that is our component set up. Now, one other thing we want to be able to do is we want to be able to view this while we're testing it. So this is pretty easy to do. NX provides tooling for Storybook. And Storybook is a UI for displaying all the different variations of your components. And we can easily do this now by installing the Storybook package. So we will do npm I at narwhal/storybook. And we'll make it a dev dependency. So that's going to install all the tooling that we need for Storybook. Great. So let's set up Storybook for our button component. Again, we're going to use the NX generate tool. You'll see here we have, if I do Storybook, we want to set up an Angular Storybook configuration. We're going to set it up for our button library, and we also want to tick generate stories. So this is going to create a story file for any components that it finds. So you can see we now have the stories file created, and we're good to run this. So let's do that. So now, once this runs, it's going to make sure everything's installed that it needs to. But we can see we now have this stories file created. So this is an easy way to view all the different variations of our component. I'm going to rename the title to just buttons. And then we are good to run this once our install phase is finished, which it has. Great. So to run Storybook, what we can do is we can do npm run nx storybook, and we'll just say button. So this is now going to build our Storybook file, and we can then launch it in our browser. And now you can see our stories. So we have the sidebar, we have our button section, and then we have the primary button variant, which we can see here. So it's called primary. Now, our button is not much to look at right now. So let's start changing this up. So one common mistake that people make when creating button components is to use an element selector. So The browser comes with a button by default, and it's good if we can leverage it. The reason being is it comes with good some accessibility features that we want to leverage. For example, if I attach a click handler on a button element, pressing spacebar will also fire the click element. This is not the case if you attach a click element to a div, for example. So, for that reason and some other accessibility things as well, it's better if we can use an attribute selector instead. So we do that by simply enclosing it in square brackets. Now you'll notice we're getting this linting error here, and that's fine. That's because in our ESLint rc.json file, we're saying components should use an element selector. We can also change this to be an attribute as well. So that will now get rid of that error, and you'll see that's fine. So I'm going to clear out this component a little bit, and you'll notice now that our story is technically wrong. Our story is going to create it as an element, and that's not what we want. So what we can do is, instead of this, what we can do is we can do template, and we can write some custom code in here. Now, first of all, just before we continue, we want to ensure that we import button module. So let's do that instead. Button module, and we can change that to button module and import it here. This is essentially like our ng module here. So this just tells Storybook what components are available to it. And in our template, we're going to do button, byt button. And now you can see you can continue using the default HTML button. We just add this attribute to it, and this allows us to put content in it as well. So I'm just going to call this primary. Okay. Now you'll notice when we view Storybook, if we reload the page, button works. Now, this isn't the text that we put in our button, but that's fine. That's to be expected. That is because in our button HTML, we have a template in here, but we want to place whatever they put inside our component instead. And that is pretty easy to do. Angular comes with a thing called ng content, and if we save that, that means whatever they put inside the button component will get placed there. And you can now see our text is correct. So let's add some styling to our button. So we'll create a host. Let's say our padding should be 0.75 rem on the x-axis and 0 on the y. And we also want to set the height to be, say, 2 rem, so 32 pixels in our case. And there we go. So you can see our button is now a little bit better spaced. So I have some additional styles here that I want to place in, and let's just see how this looks now. So we have our button presentation. We may want different variations of our component. So this is a primary button, but we may also want to support like a negative style button, so a danger button, a red button, or some other ones like secondary or anything like that. We can easily add these in. So we want to add an input. We do input. I'm going to call it color, and we can give it a type of primary, or I'm just going to do negative for now. And we'll set the default to primary. Now it's also good to give these JS doc style comments. These can help editors give some information on hover and stuff like that. So we call it define the appearance of the button. And if we save that, what we want to do is change the class that's applied to this element based on what is set here. Now there's a few ways of doing this. We can do things like, or we could do an at host binding here, and we could do class. But this can cause issues sometimes if the user wants to set a class on the button, and we are saying no, class is going to be primary or class is going to be secondary. So ideally we want to be a little bit more specific. So we can use the host attribute. Now there's a few ways of doing this. This is just the easiest one. We're going to get some linting complaints here, saying use host binding rather than the host metadata property. For this instance, in my opinion, this is preferable, so I'm going to turn this off. And there we go. So what we can do now is we can do class. I'm going to call it byt primary. The prefix is completely optional because the styles are encapsulated, so it doesn't really matter. But I'm just going to be consistent. So let's set this to primary, and this means it's going to add this class if the color is or if the color matches. And this won't cause any issues with overriding user-defined classes or anything like that. So now that we have that, we can update our styles to say byt.primary. Now again, if you are using CSS rather than Sass, you can't use the and syntax. This is purely for SCSS or less. And we'll change these colors around as well. So we've updated to add negative styles as well. Now, we're only seeing primary in our storybook. So let's change this a little bit. So this only contains one variation of the button, and we don't want to have to duplicate this every time. So there's an easy way we can change this and make this simpler. We're going to create a template for our components. We're going to import these things. Okay, I'm going to auto import from Storybook Angular story. Okay, so now we're creating a template, and essentially this allows us to define these things here. Okay, now this is saying that it's always going to be primary essentially. We'll make this a little bit more generic, we'll just call it button. And we have this props thing, so this allows us to pass in values to our template. And we're going to do color equals color. And we'll see why this can work in a second. So we're going to change this up a little bit. I want to change this to be template.bind, which essentially is like cloning this here, and then we can pass in different values for each one. So we can say primary.args, and we can say color equals primary, and we also want a negative one. So let's create negative. Let's rename all those negative. Great. So if we save that now and go here, you can see we have two variations and they change color. Now, last thing I want to show you in terms of button, obviously you can add more styling as you see fit, but we want to talk about focus and focus indicators. So by default, whenever you focus something in the browser, you get this default outline. Now the problem is this happens also whenever we click on a button, and that can be a bit of a bad user experience. Ideally, what we want is focus is useful when someone is using a keyboard rather than clicking. So to fix this, we can use the Angular Cdk. So let's stop Storybook for a second and install @Angular Cdk. And this is a collection of utilities and components and directives and stuff like that that the Angular team have produced and provided for us. It's documented on the Angular material site. Under CDK, and you can see they provide a wide array of useful utilities. And the one we're talking about is in accessibility. It's called Focus Monitor, and this allows us to identify whether an element was focused using the keyboard or mouse click, for example. Now they have directives, but because we're using it on the host element, we need to use it programmatically. And what we can do is import from @Angular Cdk /A11y, and we want to bring in the focus monitor. Now we don't need to import anything because this is a service and it's provided en route. So what we can do is we can add a constructor. We will need the element ref, and this is of type button. And we also want private read only focus monitor. Okay, and that's all we need to get started. What we do, however, need is we want to implement on Init. So this is what we're going to run whenever we initialize the component, and we want to tear down the logic on destroy. So we do ng on destroy void and ng on init void, save that. So what we want to do is this dot focus monitor dot monitor, this dot element ref, and very similarly this dot stop monitoring, this dot element ref. Now what this does is if we look in Storybook now and we inspect our element, this is going to add a class to this element whenever, let's get this a little bit bigger for you. So you can see if I tab to this, you can see we now get CDK keyboard focus class whenever I tab on it. Whenever I don't or click or whatever, it doesn't get that. So what we can do now is we can, in our styles, we can say if it is focused, so this is the default browser focus, we set outline to none, but if it has the CDK keyboard focused class, then what we can do is we can add an outline. In this case, I prefer like a box shadow outline, so I'll just say 000 3px, and we'll do something like make this slightly opacity, or get some opacity. We'll change this to RGBA, and we'll set it to 20%. Let's see how that looks. And there we go. You can see now whenever we tab to it, we get an outline. If we click on it, we don't. And you might want to change this so it's blue on both primary and negative equally. You could alter that so we move this into the primary, and we can do something like this in the negative. So let's just paste that in there. We'll change it to RGB. Why did that not work? Okay, right, there we go, that's better. And we'll change it to 20%. And there we go. We now have a red one and a blue one. So there you have it. That is how to create a button component with documentation, with some variations and accessibility in mind. So that's all for this tutorial, and check out the next one. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe.